The deed was already in Ruby Townsend's hand when Ralph Talbot opened his mouth. "Miss Townsend," he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of slow, deliberate condescension she had been hearing from men her entire life. "This property is not suitable for A." She slapped the folded paper down on the county clerk's desk with a sound like a gunshot. "Filed," she said. The clerk, a thin man named Harlan Webb, who had been sitting behind that desk for 14 years and had never once seen anything like this, looked from the paper to the woman to the rancher and back to the paper again. His pen was still hovering in the air from where he had been about to complete some other, far more ordinary transaction. Ralph Talbot stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall in his boots. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw carved from the same red sandstone that made up the canyons east of Dusty Creek, Texas. He had ridden into this clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, expecting nothing more complicated than a land dispute he already considered settled. He had expected to purchase the Holloway parcel, 412 acres of prime grazing land along the South Fork of the Cimarron River, before noon. He had expected to be back in his saddle before the sun reached its highest point. He had not expected Ruby Townsend. "You cannot be serious," Ralph said. Ruby turned and looked at him fully for the first time since she had walked into that office 20 minutes ahead of him, which was something she had done deliberately, because she had known he was coming, because she had done her research, because Ruby Townsend did not walk into any room without knowing exactly who else intended to walk into it. She was 28 years old. She had dark red hair that she wore pinned tight against the back of her head in a way that suggested she did not trust loose things. Her eyes were the particular gray-green of storm clouds building over open flatland, and right now they were aimed at Ralph Talbot with the focused intensity of a rifle sight. "The clerk will confirm it," she said. "The deed is filed." "That land," Ralph started. "Is mine," she finished. The room went very quiet. Outside on the main street of Dusty Creek, a horse stomped, and a woman called to someone across the way, and a wagon wheel hit a rut in the packed dirt road. But inside the clerk's office, there was the particular silence that comes when two very strong and very opposing forces have just discovered they are occupying the same space. This was the moment everything truly began. 3 weeks earlier, Ruby Townsend had been standing in a law office in San Antonio reading her uncle's will. Her uncle Clarence had been a stubborn, independent, and deeply private man who had spent 30 years acquiring land in the Texas Panhandle and the strip of Oklahoma territory that bordered it. He had never married, had no children of his own, and had outlasted 3 of his 4 siblings. When the consumption finally took him in the winter of 1882, he left everything he owned to his niece Ruby, who was the only member of his family he had ever considered to have what he called practical sense. The will was precise. Clarence Holloway had left Ruby the house in San Antonio, his savings account at the First National Bank, and the Holloway parcel along the Cimarron River, which he had acquired 8 years earlier and had been leasing to neighboring ranchers for grazing rights. Ruby had known about the land. She had visited it once, when she was 19, and her uncle had taken her out on horseback to show her what he was building. She remembered the way the river bent through the low cottonwoods, the way the grass grew thick and sweet in the bottomland, the way the sky opened up above the canyon rim and made you feel simultaneously very small and very free. She had loved it instantly, the way you love something that feels like it was always meant to belong to you. She had spent the 9 years since that visit building a different kind of life. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a shipping firm in San Antonio, then as an accounts manager when her employer discovered she could do in 4 hours what his previous manager had required a full day to accomplish. She had saved her money carefully. She had read everything she could find about land management, cattle ranching, and the water rights disputes that were reshaping the Texas and Oklahoma territories. She had learned to ride properly, not the careful side-saddle trot considered appropriate for ladies, but the hard, efficient riding of someone who needs to cover ground quickly. When her uncle's lawyer read the will, and then looked up at her over his spectacles with the particular expression that meant he was about to say something he considered important, Ruby had already decided what she was going to do. There has been some interest expressed in the Holloway parcel, the lawyer, a careful man named Edmund Briggs, had told her. A rancher by the name of Talbot, Ralph Talbot. He has a substantial operation about 12 miles north of your uncle's land, and he has been leasing the grazing rights for the past 4 years. He has been expecting the opportunity to purchase the parcel outright, and it is my understanding that he has already spoken with several parties in anticipation of acquiring it. Who were those parties? Ruby asked. Briggs had looked uncomfortable. Your uncle's estate, before the will was finalized. There was some expectation that the land might be sold rather than inherited. By whom? By Mr. Talbot. Based on what? Briggs adjusted his spectacles. Based on his understanding that your uncle had no heirs who would want a working ranch in the Panhandle. Ruby had sat with that for exactly 1 moment. Well, she said, he understood incorrectly. She had taken the train north from San Antonio 4 days later, carrying 2 trunks, a leather satchel containing every document related to her inheritance, and a copy of the Texas land statutes that she had read 3 times on the journey. She arrived in Dusty Creek on a Monday evening, checked into the town's single hotel, and spent the night reading the county land records that the hotel owner's wife had been kind enough to point her toward. That was when she discovered that Ralph Talbot had already submitted a purchase offer to the probate court, citing a verbal agreement with her late uncle. Ruby had been in the county clerk's office when it opened at 8 in the morning on Tuesday. She had the deed transfer completed and witnessed by 9:15. At 9:30, Ralph Talbot walked through the door. She had watched him come in from where she was standing near the window, and her first thought had been that he was exactly what she expected. Tall, certain, and completely unprepared for opposition. Her second thought, which she was not particularly pleased to have, was that he was also extraordinarily handsome in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who has spent most of his life outdoors. She dismissed the second thought immediately. It was not relevant. What was relevant was the deed now sitting on Harlan Webb's desk bearing her name. Ralph Talbot stared at the document for a long time. He had large hands, the knuckles were cruffined, and he had them balled at his sides with the controlled tension of a man who was accustomed to solving problems physically, but knew this particular problem required a different approach. His dark eyes moved from the deed to Ruby's face and held there. I had an arrangement with your uncle, he said. His voice had dropped from the public register into something quieter and more direct. Did you have it in writing? Ruby asked, a pause. No. Then you had a conversation, she said. I have a deed. Miss Townsend, he said her name as though testing its weight. That land is ranch land. It requires management, water access, proper fencing, and a working knowledge of cattle grazing rotations, Ruby said. I have studied all 4. It requires physical labor. It requires men, she said flatly. You were going to say it requires men. I am aware that ranching requires labor, Mr. Talbot. I intend to hire it. He looked at her for another long moment. She looked back. Behind them, Harlan Webb had set down his pen and appeared to be doing his best to become invisible. You have no idea what you are taking on, Ralph said. You have no idea who you are talking to, Ruby replied. She picked up her leather satchel, nodded to Harlan Webb, and walked out of the county clerk's office into the bright April morning of Dusty Creek, Texas, leaving Ralph Talbot standing in the middle of the room holding nothing but the memory of a conversation he had completely lost. The Holloway property was in significantly worse condition than the documents had suggested. Ruby rode out to it 2 days after filing the deed, accompanied by a local man named Chester Pratt who had agreed to serve as her guide for the day. Chester was 62 years old, had a limp from a horse accident in 1871, and had been a fixture in Dusty Creek long enough to remember when it had been called something else. He had agreed to show Ruby her land without editorial comment, which she appreciated, though she suspected the absence of comment was merely temporary. The house was a two-room structure that her uncle had built for the occasional overnight stays he made while checking on the property. It needed new roofing, and the chimney had partially collapsed. The fencing along the south boundary had been knocked down in what Chester said was likely a winter storm. The river access was good, he acknowledged that, but there had been some erosion along the bank near the eastern bend that would require attention before the summer rains came. How much of this was Talbot's doing? Ruby asked as she walked the perimeter of the collapsed fence, examining the post holes. Chester scratched his chin. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that the grazing lease ended when my uncle died. Mr. Talbot's cattle have not been on this land legally for 6 weeks. And yet I can see from the track patterns that cattle have been on the south pasture very recently." Chester was quiet for a moment. "I would not have figured you for someone who reads track patterns," he said. "I read everything," she said. He looked at the ground, then at the fence, then at the distant line of hills that marked the boundary of what was, she already knew, Ralph Talbot's operation. "I would not say it was his deliberate doing," he said finally. "But his boys have not been keeping his herd tight since the lease lapsed. Whether that is carelessness or something else, I cannot tell you." Ruby looked at the tracks again. "I can," she said quietly. She spent the next week in a state of concentrated, furious productivity. She hired 2 ranch hands from the pool of men available in Dusty Creek, a young man named Will Decker who was 23 and capable, and a slightly older man named Frank Orozco who had worked cattle across the Panhandle for 8 years, and whose references were impeccable. She arranged for a freight wagon to bring lumber from the nearest supply town for the roof and fencing repairs. She negotiated with the hotel to continue her accommodations at a reduced rate while the ranch house was being made livable, securing a price reduction in exchange for reviewing the owner's account books, which turned out to be in catastrophic disarray. She also filed a formal complaint with the county land office about the unauthorized grazing, specifically citing that Ralph Talbot's cattle had been on her land without permission following the expiration of the lease. The complaint landed on Ralph Talbot's desk in the form of an official notice on a Wednesday. She knew about it because Chester Pratt mentioned, in the casual way that small towns communicate everything, that he had seen Ralph Talbot reading a piece of paper in front of the land office and looking as though someone had just dropped a lit match into his hat. She was in the middle of reviewing lumber prices when Chester told her this. She set down her pencil, permitted herself exactly 3 seconds of quiet satisfaction, and then went back to the lumber prices. The second time she saw Ralph Talbot was not at a government office. It was at the Dusty Creek General Store on a Thursday afternoon in the dry goods aisle, where Ruby was purchasing lamp oil and he was apparently purchasing the same. They reached for adjacent cans at the same moment. Their hands did not touch. They both stepped back. "Miss Townsend," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and there was dust on his boots that told her he had ridden in rather than driven a wagon. He looked tired around the eyes in a way that she had not noticed in the clerk's office, or perhaps had not permitted herself to notice. Also looked, she observed with some annoyance, like a man who was genuinely struggling with something rather than simply being obstructive. "I received your complaint," he said. "I expected you would," she said. "I want you to know that the grazing was not intentional." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I am not certain I believe that." He held her gaze, a beat past. "Fair enough," he said. "I have pulled my herd back to the north pasture. You will not see my cattle on your land again." She had been prepared for defensiveness, for dismissal, for the kind of aggressive posturing that men in positions of local authority often defaulted to when challenged. She had not been quite prepared for this direct acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said, because it was the honest response and Ruby valued honesty above most other things. "Your men are doing good work on that south fence," he said. She blinked. "You have been watching my property." "I have been watching the south boundary line," he said carefully, "which is also my north boundary line. I notice what happens there as a matter of routine." This was reasonable. She acknowledged it was reasonable. "The fence will be complete by the end of next week," she said. "I am also rebuilding the house roof." "The chimney needs rebuilding from the third course up," she said. "I know. I have already sourced the stone." Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, an adjustment in the way he was looking at her, a recalibration. "You have done your homework," he said. "I always do," she said. She took her lamp oil and moved to the counter, aware of his eyes following her in a way that she told herself was merely the natural attention of someone who has just been surprised. The roof was completed first, then the fence, then the chimney. By the middle of May, Ruby had moved out of the hotel and into the ranch house, which was small and plain but solid, and smelled of fresh pine lumber and whitewash. She had brought very little from San Antonio. Her books, her account ledgers, the small framed photograph of her parents that she kept on the windowsill, and the embroidered quilt her mother had made before she died, which Ruby had not slept without since she was 7 years old. Will Decker and Frank Orozco were sleeping in the bunkhouse, which was a generous term for a single-room outbuilding that had also needed repairs. She had hired a third hand, a quiet man named Samuel Reeves who was 40 and had the particular stillness of someone who had seen most things life had to offer and had made his peace with them. She had also acquired 6 head of cattle. This was, she knew, laughably few for the size of her land. 412 acres along the Cimarron could carry considerably more. But she had learned in her reading that beginning modestly and building carefully was far superior to overextending early, a lesson that applied equally to cattle ranching and accounting. She was in the habit of riding the property boundary each morning, a circuit that took about an hour and that she used partly for practical inspection, and partly because she had discovered that the quality of her thinking improved dramatically when she was on horseback and moving. On a morning in late May, she came around the eastern bend of the river and found a man sitting on a horse on the boundary line, Ralph Talbot. He was simply sitting there on a big bay gelding, looking at the river bend where the erosion had been. Ruby pulled up her own horse, a sturdy gray mare she had named Arithmetic, and regarded him across the line. "There is erosion upstream from here," he said without preamble. "On my land. It is pushing the problem down onto your bank." She had already noted this. "I know. I am planning to do some bank shoring work next week. It would make sense to coordinate. If we work both banks together, the repair holds better." She considered him. He was making a practical suggestion about a shared problem. He was not offering help in a way that implied she needed rescuing. He was proposing cooperation in the way that one property owner might logically propose cooperation with another. "What would that coordination involve?" she asked. "My men would work the north bank. If your men worked the south bank simultaneously, using roughly the same method, the current would not simply shift the problem from one side to the other." "What method?" He described it: rock and timber reinforcement at specific intervals, following the natural contour of the bank. It was precisely the approach she had read about in a land management pamphlet she had found in her uncle's papers. "That is consistent with what I was planning," she said. "Then we agree," he said. "On this specific point," she said. His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "On this specific point," he agreed. He turned his horse north and rode back toward his own land. Ruby watched him go for exactly long enough to confirm that the bay gelding had good conformation, and that Ralph Talbot sat a horse the way someone does when they grew up riding rather than learning as an adult. She turned Arithmetic back toward the house and did not think about Ralph Talbot for the rest of the morning. She was mostly successful. The bank shoring happened as planned in the first week of June. Ruby worked alongside Will and Frank and Samuel, while Ralph's crew worked the north bank. She was in the river in boots and practical clothes, moving rock and timber with her own hands, which she could see surprised Ralph's men considerably when they looked across the water and saw her there. Ralph himself was also working, sleeves rolled up, knee-deep in water, and she caught him looking at her once with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not condescension. It was something more complicated. At midday they stopped for food on their respective banks, and Ruby found herself sitting 20 feet from Ralph Talbot across a width of moving water, close enough to speak but not close enough to require it. "You are not what I expected," he called across. "You expected me to fail and sell to you," she said. He had the honesty to pause before he answered. "I expected you to find it harder than you anticipated and reconsider. Because I am a woman. Because you came from a city," he said. "Because you had never run a ranch." "I had never run a ranch by the day I arrived," she said. "The definition has adjusted." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." There was a particular quality to that acknowledgement. Not reluctance, exactly. More like the adjustment of someone who has been looking at something from the wrong angle and has just turned their head and seen it clearly for the first time. Ruby ate her biscuit and looked at the river and tried not to find the moment as significant as some part of her very much wanted to. By July, the ranch was running. It was not yet profitable. She needed a larger herd for that, but it was operating. The cattle were healthy. The fences were holding. She had a kitchen garden that was producing beans and squash. She had learned to bake cornbread in the cast-iron skillet on the wood stove with a reliability that would have astonished her San Antonio self. She had also, quietly and without fanfare, begun to understand what her uncle had loved about this land. The mornings along the Cimarron were unlike anything she had known in the city. The light came up over the canyon rim in layers, rose and gold and finally white, and the river caught it and scattered it. The cottonwood trees along the bank held mockingbirds that sang so variously, and with such apparent joy that she had begun to look forward to them, the way she had once looked forward to her morning coffee. She was sitting on the front step of the ranch house one evening in mid-July, reviewing the accounts by the last of the daylight, when she heard a horse coming up the track from the road. Ralph Talbot rode into the yard and dismounted with the ease of someone who does not think about the movement at all. He was carrying something under his arm. "I brought this," he said. He handed her a book. She looked at it. It was a copy of A Cattleman's Guide to Water-Efficient Grazing Rotations, the most current edition, printed in 1881. She looked up at him. "You mentioned in passing that you were having trouble finding the current edition," he said. "I had it sent from Fort Worth 3 weeks ago. I was going to read it myself, but I already know most of it." "You had it sent for me," she said. "For both of us," he said, a little too quickly. Then with slightly less evasion, "Mostly for you." She turned the book over in her hands. The gesture was so practical and so unexpectedly thoughtful that it caught her completely off guard, which almost never happened. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked at his horse and then looked back at her. "How are the 6 cattle?" he asked. 8, she said. "I acquired 2 more last week." 8 cattle, he repeated, "on 400 acres. I told you I was starting modestly," she said. "At this rate you will have a full herd by approximately 1900, he said. She looked at him. The sun was going down behind him, and it was doing things to the light around him that she considered deeply unfair. "That is remarkably close to humor," she said. "I have been told I have it," he said, "occasionally." "By whom?" "My foreman, mostly. He is the kind of man who finds amusement in adversity." "What is his name?" "Mac, James MacDonald. He has been with me 11 years. He paused. "He would like to meet you." "Why?" "Because he says anyone who files a deed before a rancher finishes talking deserves respect, and he would like to demonstrate some." Ruby stared at him. "He knows about that." "Everyone in Dusty Creek knows about that," Ralph said. "It is, by some considerable margin, the most interesting thing that has happened here in 2 years." She burst out laughing. She had not intended to. It came out full and genuine, and she did not manage to stop it quickly enough to maintain her composure. Ralph Talbot looked at her with an expression of evident pleasure, as though this was something he had been hoping to cause and had not expected to succeed at. "I suppose it is rather remarkable," she said, when she had recovered herself. "It is," he said. "I have to admit that no one has ever done that to me before." "Good," she said. "You are entirely unapologetic about it," he observed. "I am," she said. He stood there for another moment, and she sat on the step, and the evening came down around them, and the mockingbirds in the cottonwoods were running through their final repertoire of the day. "I was wrong," he said, "about the property. It is entirely suitable." She looked up at him. "I know it is," she said, "but thank you for saying so." He touched his hat brim and went back to his horse, and she watched him ride out of the yard and down the road, and she sat for a long time afterward with the account books closed in her lap, and the copy of the Cattleman's Guide on the step beside her. She told herself, very firmly, that a rancher riding over to bring a book was a neighborly act and nothing more. She did not entirely believe it. Mac MacDonald was a broad Scotsman in his mid-40s who had come to Texas by way of Glasgow, New Orleans, and a cattle drive that he described as having been simultaneously the worst and most formative experience of his existence. He had a red-gray beard and a handshake that could have cracked walnuts, and he looked at Ruby when he met her with the frank and cheerful approval of someone who has had excellent judgment confirmed. "I told him he was wrong from the start," Mac said, pouring coffee at the small table in the Talbot Ranch house kitchen, where Ruby had been invited for a meeting she had initially regarded with some suspicion and which had turned out to be entirely practical. Ralph wanted to discuss a joint approach to the seasonal cattle drive that both their operations needed. "What did he say?" Ruby asked. Mac grinned. "He said I did not understand the situation. And now?" "Now he says I understood it fine," Mac said comfortably. "He just needed to get there himself." Ruby looked across the table at Ralph, who was looking at Mac with the expression of someone who has decided that having a forthright foreman is a character-building experience. The meeting was productive. They worked out a shared drive schedule that would take both their herds to the market town of Caldwell in September, reducing costs for both operations, and allowing them to share the labor of the drive with a combined crew. It was a business arrangement, purely practical. Ruby rode home thinking about it in purely practical terms. She also thought about the way Ralph had made sure her coffee cup was refilled before his own, which was also, she decided, purely practical hospitality. She thought about the way his foreman looked at him when he was talking, with the easy loyalty of someone who has been with a person long enough to know their whole story and has decided they are worth knowing. She thought about the book still on her bedside table. She went back to the accounts. The summer deepened into a heat that was particular to the Texas Panhandle, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer, and the cattle stand very still in whatever shade they can find, and the river lower than it ought to be. Ruby learned the rhythms of it. The work in the early morning when it was still cool, the midday withdrawal to whatever shade was available, the late afternoon return to labor as the temperature eased. She learned to read the sky for weather in the way you could only learn from being out in it. The particular cloud formations that preceded the thunderstorms that could roll through with terrifying speed, the way the wind changed direction before rain, the difference between a bank of clouds that would pass and one that would not. She was good at this land. She felt it with increasing certainty and something that was close to wonder. She had arrived here with knowledge from books and sheer determination, and a certain stubbornness that she had inherited in equal parts from both of her parents. But she had not entirely anticipated the way the land itself would teach her things that books could not, the feel of good soil in her hands, the way you could tell by watching where cattle chose to graze which grass was sweet and which was not, the strange deep satisfaction of having made something work through nothing but intelligence and effort and will. She was out in the late afternoon checking the east fence line when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and turned to find Ralph riding toward her at an easy pace. His hat was pushed back and he had the relaxed look of someone taking a route home rather than riding with purpose. "Everything holding?" he asked, nodding at the fence. "Well," she said, "better than the Hendricks line to the south." She had been watching the Hendricks operation, a neighboring property run by a man who was neither a bad person nor a competent rancher, with increasing concern. "I think they have a drainage problem developing." "They do," Ralph said. "Old Bert has had it for years. He will not address it. It is going to affect his east pasture by next spring," she said. "I know." He pulled up alongside her. They rode together along the fence line in the same direction, which seemed natural and was, Ruby told herself, simply a matter of shared route. "What brought you to this land?" he asked. "You had a life in San Antonio, work you were good at." "I was very good at it," she agreed. "And I was useful in it, but useful and alive are not the same thing." He looked at her. "I mean," she said, trying to be precise about something she had not articulated to anyone before, "that I was doing work that mattered to someone else's enterprise, which is a legitimate thing to do, but this is mine. This land, this operation, every decision made on it is mine, every failure and every success mine." "That is also a heavy weight," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it is my weight to carry, that is the difference." He rode in silence for a moment. "I inherited this land from my father," he said. "He built it from nothing, 30 acres, when he came from Virginia in 1861. He was 18 years old. He came during the war. He left to avoid it," Ralph said. "He had no argument with anyone on either side. He just wanted land." She looked at his profile. There was something careful in the way he was telling this. The way people are careful when they are telling you the real thing rather than the version they tell most people. "He built it to nearly 1,200 acres before he died," Ralph said. "I was 22, I have added the rest." "You were 22 and you took on 1,200 acres, she said. "It was that or sell," he said. "I was not going to sell." "No," she said. "I did not think you would." They had reached the corner of her fence line where her property boundary turned north. He would continue east toward his own land. She pulled arithmetic up and he stopped beside her. "Ralph," she said, using his given name for the first time. It came out before she had entirely decided to say it. He looked at her with a quiet attention that she found difficult to look away from. "Thank you for not making this harder than it needed to be," she said. "After the clerk's office, you could have." "I considered it," he said honestly, "for about 2 days." "What changed?" He looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon light was gold and warm, and the river was audible from here, a low constant sound. "I realized," he said carefully, "that I was angry because you had outmaneuvered me, which was a fair thing to be, and I was also angry because I had assumed something about you without evidence, which was not." "Most men do not make that distinction," she said. "I know," he said. "My mother would have corrected me severely if I had not." Ruby looked at him. "Your mother sounds remarkable." "She was," he said. "She came from Virginia with my father, and she built that house, and she ran an operation while he was building fence, and she never once waited to be told what to do." A brief pause. "She would have liked you considerably." Something in Ruby's chest moved in a way she was not prepared for. She looked away toward the river. "I would have liked her," she said. He turned his horse east. "Good night, Ruby," he said. "Good night, Ralph," she said. She rode home in the golden evening and sat on the front step for a long time watching the stars come out, one by one, over the canyon rim, and she thought about what it meant to have a weight that was entirely your own to carry. And she thought about the fact that a weight shared does not necessarily mean a weight surrendered. And she thought about his mother and his 22-year-old self standing in front of 1,200 acres with nothing but will and necessity. She went inside. She made her coffee. She read the Cattleman's Guide until the lamp oil ran low, and then she went to bed under her mother's quilt, and she lay in the dark, and she was aware, with a precise and inconvenient clarity, that she was falling in love with Ralph Talbot. She was not at all sure what to do about it. What she decided to do about it was nothing, for the time being. She had a ranch to run and a cattle drive to prepare for, and she was not going to allow any feeling, however genuine and however increasingly difficult to ignore, to destabilize what she had built here. She had come to this land for herself. She had filed that deed for herself. She had put her hands in this river and this soil for herself. Whatever happened with Ralph Talbot was separate from that, had to remain separate from that until she was certain of it. The problem was that certainty was arriving with inconvenient speed. He came by 3 more times in August on various practical pretexts. Once to discuss the shared drive logistics. Once to warn her about a storm system he had heard about from a passing freighter. Once, and this was the pretextual one, to return a fence staple that he said one of her men had left on his side of the boundary, which was a journey of 12 miles for an object worth approximately 3 cents, and which he clearly knew she would recognize as a pretextual errand, and which he clearly had decided to undertake anyway. That last time he had stayed for an hour, and they had sat on her front step in the evening and talked about books, which was something she had not done with another person in 2 years, not since a brief and unsatisfying friendship with a woman in San Antonio who had subsequently moved to Houston. Ralph had read more than she expected and thought about what he read more carefully than most people she had ever met, and he had opinions that he was willing to revise in mid-conversation when she presented a counter-argument he found compelling, which was an exceptionally rare quality. "You revised your position twice in the last 20 minutes, she told him. "You made good arguments," he said. "Most people do not change their minds when presented with good arguments," she said. "They find ways to preserve the original position." "That seems like a waste of a good argument," he said. She looked at him. The lamp inside the window was casting light out across the step, and he was half in it and half in the dark, and she thought that this was, possibly, the most interesting person she had ever sat on a step with. "Ruby," he said, and the way he said her name had changed over the summer. It had started as a name and it had become something else, something that carried the weight of everything they had been building toward since April. "Do not say something that will complicate the cattle drive preparation," she said. "We have 6 weeks." His mouth curved. "I was not going to." "What were you going to say?" A long pause, the river in the dark, the mockingbirds finally silent. "That I am glad you filed that deed," he said. "I was not at the time, but I am now." Ruby breathed. "So am I," she said quietly. They sat there for a while longer and he rode home, and she stood in the yard listening to the horse fade down the dark road, and she thought that the particular quality of this feeling, this honest, growing, terrifying thing, was not something she had ever encountered before, and she was not entirely sure she knew how to live inside it. The cattle drive was 23 days. They left in early September with a combined herd of 94 head, 8 riders including Ralph and Ruby herself, and Mac Donald running the trail organization with the competence of someone born to it. Frank Orozco and Will Decker and Samuel Reeves were there, and Ralph's men. A quiet older hand named Eli, 2 younger brothers named Tors, and a man called Crane who had done this drive 7 times and could read the trail as if it were printed in large type. The first 3 days were straightforward. The weather held, the herd moved well, the terrain was familiar to most of the crew. On the 4th day, near the Oklahoma border, they hit trouble. It came in the form of a dry creek crossing that had silted up since anyone on the crew had last used this trail. What should have been a shallow ford was now a deep-cut channel with unstable banks, and the first dozen cattle to approach it balked completely and began to drift back into the herd in a way that threatened a general upset. Ralph was at the front of the herd. Ruby was riding the east flank. She could see what was happening before the shout went up, and she was already moving, pushing arithmetic along the edge of the herd to reach the crossing point. What she had understood, and what the men at the front had not immediately seen, was that there was a natural ford about 200 yards upstream where a sandbar had built up on the inside of a bend, creating a shallower crossing. She had spotted it when they were moving along the creek bank and had filed it away without thinking much about it, the way she filed away everything she observed. "Upstream," she called when she reached the front of the herd. 200 yards. There is a ford." Ralph looked at her. "You are certain?" "I saw it when we came down the bank," she said. "Sandbar formation. It will hold." A moment of decision. He made it instantly. "Crane," he called, "we move upstream." The crossing took an hour and it held exactly as she had said it would, and on the other side Ralph rode up beside her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not admiration in the simple sense. It was something deeper, more specific. The recognition of one competent person by another. "You saved us 3 hours minimum," he said. "If the herd had scattered, we would have spent the rest of the day regathering." "I noticed the ford," she said. "That is all. You noticed it and you remembered it and you acted on it," he said. "That is not all, that is everything." She looked at him, and the sun was bright and the cattle were moving and the crew was busy, and she said, "Ralph." "Ruby," he said. "When we get back from this drive," she said, "I would like you to come to dinner." Something lit in his face, not the quick bright flare of surprise, but something slower and more certain. "Yes," he said, "I would like that very much." They rode on. Mac MacDonald, who had positioned himself at a diplomatically chosen distance, was looking at the sky with an expression of profound satisfaction. The rest of the drive was not without incident. There was a storm on day 9 that scattered 40 head and required a full day of regathering. There was a tense encounter on day 14 with another drive crew who disputed trail rights at a water source, which was resolved by Ralph and Ruby presenting a unified front of such calm, documented certainty that the other crew's manager backed down without ever quite being sure how it had happened. There was a night on day 18 when the temperature dropped unexpectedly, and they sat around a fire that was larger than practical, and someone produced a fiddle, and the crew made music under a sky so dense with stars it seemed impossible that this same sky could ever be clouded. Ruby sat beside Ralph at that fire, and at some point during the second song she became aware that they were sitting closer than they had been at the start of the evening, and neither of them had consciously moved. His arm was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it. She did not move away. He did not move away. Crane, who had 14 years on trail drives and had seen most things, played a slow song on his fiddle and looked at the fire with peaceful indifference. They reached Caldwell on day 23 and sold the cattle at a price that made Ruby's accounts breathe considerably more easily. She stood at the stockyard fence watching the last of her cattle go through the gate, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed, a proof of work established. Ralph came to stand beside her. "Profitable drive?" she asked. "The most profitable I have had in 4 years," he said. "I have money for the winter and surplus for early spring stock," she said, "which is considerably more than I had in April." He looked out at the stockyard. "Ruby," he said. "Not until dinner," she said. He laughed. It was a full laugh, not the restrained near smile she had seen before, and the sound of it did something significant to her internal situation that she chose not to analyze in a stockyard. They rode home over 4 days. The crew gradually dispersed as people split off toward their home ranches. By the final day it was Ruby and Ralph and Mac and Frank Orozco, riding parallel tracks through the late September afternoon, and it was comfortable in the way of people who have spent 3 weeks doing hard work together and know each other in the specific and reliable way that hard work creates. Mac at one point drifted far enough back to be entirely elsewhere, and left Ruby and Ralph riding side by side through the grass in a silence that was neither uncomfortable nor empty. "I owe you an apology," Ralph said. She glanced at him. "Properly," he said. "Not just the acknowledgement I gave you at the river bank. I mean a real one." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I walked into that clerk's office assuming I knew what you were and what you could and could not do. I had never spoken with you. I knew nothing about you except that you were a woman who had inherited land. And I made the specific error of assuming that those 2 facts told me something about your capabilities." "They did not," she said. "No," he said. "They told me nothing except my own limitations." She rode for a moment. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, "genuinely. I have been thinking about it since the first week," he said. "Since the bank shoring, since the drive, since he stopped." "Since what?" "Since the first evening I brought the book," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the direct, open attention of someone who has decided to stop finding reasons for indirection. "Dinner," she said. "Come on Sunday." "Sunday," he said. She cooked a proper meal, which was not something she had occasion to do often. Roast chicken and cornbread and beans from the garden and a dried apple pie that turned out better than she had any right to expect given that her baking confidence was still developing. She set the table with the single good tablecloth she owned, which had also been her mother's, and she put a jar of late wildflowers in the center of it, which she then removed, thought about, and then put back. Ralph arrived on time, which she noticed. He had changed his clothes, which she also noticed, without appearing to have done so consciously, which made it considerably more affecting than it would have been if it were obvious. He brought wine from a bottle he had apparently been saving, which told its own story. They ate and talked for 3 hours. They talked about books and about the land and about their respective histories, and about the particular loneliness of building something from very few resources and how that loneliness was both terrible and necessary. Ruby told him about her parents, who had died when she was 12, and about the years she had spent in her uncle's house in San Antonio, and the steady determination she had built around herself like architecture to keep moving forward. Ralph told her about his father and the early years when the ranch was not yet certain, and the winter of 1873, when they had nearly lost everything to a drought that dried the river entirely. He told her about a woman he had been engaged to briefly when he was 27. She had come from Kansas and she had been kind, but she had not loved the land and she had gone back to Kansas, and he had understood completely and had not blamed her and had missed her for a year, and then had stopped missing her because what he had actually missed was the idea rather than the person. "And since then?" Ruby asked. "Since then," he said, looking at her across the small table in the lamplight, "I have been waiting for the specific thing rather than the general idea." Ruby breathed carefully. "Is that what you are doing now?" she asked. "Waiting? No," he said. "I do not think I am waiting anymore." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp burned and the wildflowers sat in their jar, and the night outside was the particular deep quiet of the panhandle autumn. "I am not a woman who will live in your shadow, Ralph," she said. "I will not become a secondary consideration on land I was secondary to before I got here. I need you to understand that clearly." "Ruby," he said with a directness that matched hers entirely, "the thought of you in anyone's shadow is genuinely absurd to me, including mine." "Good," she said. "And I need you to understand," he said carefully, "that I am a man who is accustomed to being the most decided person in any room, which is occasionally a problem, and that I am working on it." "I have noticed that," she said, "both the quality and the working on it." "And," he said, "and," she said, "I find both of them acceptable." He smiled. The full version, not the restrained one. It changed his face completely, and she was grateful she had seen it enough times now that she could receive it without visible disruption. "Then," he said, "I wonder if you would allow me to come back next Sunday." "Yes," she said, "I would." "And the Sunday after that?" "Yes," she said again. He stayed until 10 o'clock, which was quite late by ranch standards where the day began at 5:30, and when he left she stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats down the road, and she looked up at the stars, and she thought that whatever happened from here, she was not afraid of it. She had been afraid of many things in her life. She was not afraid of this. The Sundays became a fixed point of the week. Then there were evenings that were not Sundays. Then there were mornings when he would ride over to look at something on the property and stay long enough for coffee, and the conversation would run on regardless of the practical pretexts. They were both, she understood, constitutionally unsuited to either rushing or waiting. They were people who moved toward things with intention when they were certain, and with caution when they were not, and the movement between them had its own pace that respected this in both of them. In November he kissed her. It was after an evening in late autumn when they had been sitting by her fire reading separate books, which had become a comfortable habit, and she had looked up to find him already looking at her, and the recognition between them had been so complete and so obvious that there was nothing to do but close the distance. It was a quiet kiss, careful and serious and entirely genuine, like everything about him. When it was over, she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing to say that the kiss had not already said more precisely than language could manage. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yes," he said. "Exactly." The winter was hard, as panhandle winters tend to be. January brought a blizzard that kept people inside for 4 days and nearly froze the south water trough before Frank and Samuel managed to rig a heating solution that Ruby had read about in a farming almanac and adapted. The cattle were brought in close and fed from the stores she had laid in. She had learned from Ralph and from Mac and from Chester Pratt and from the land itself how to winter a herd in this country, and she did it well. Ralph sent Mac over 3 times during the worst of it with supplies, and twice came himself, riding through snow that she considered excessive for a social call, and that he considered entirely reasonable. During one storm that made the yard outside completely invisible in blowing white. They were trapped inside her house for 6 hours, and they played cards and argued about land policy, and he made coffee because he had grown up at a higher altitude and understood fire management better than she did. And she conceded this one specific point without conceding anything else, and he looked at her with the deeply warm expression of a man who is completely happy in a very specific way that has nothing to do with winning. She was aware, with a fullness she could not have articulated if she had tried, that she loved him, not the idea of him. The specific and particular and occasionally maddening reality of him, including the stubbornness that was as deeply rooted as her own, and the way he occasionally assumed he knew what she was going to say before she finished saying it, and the way he apologized when he did that, briefly and sincerely, and then did not do it again for at least 2 weeks. She had not yet said it. He had not said it. They were both, she thought, waiting for the right moment, which was probably a simultaneous acknowledgement that they were each other's right moment. The right moment happened in February. It was a clear day, cold but windless, and they were riding the south boundary line together on a routine inspection that had become less routine and more simply an occasion to be in the same space doing the same thing. The river was low and glassy with cold. The cottonwoods were bare, but the bark had that dormant silver quality that makes winter trees beautiful in a way that leafed ones are not. They had stopped on the rise above the river bend where she had first found him, back in the summer. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it at that particular moment. It simply arrived in her mouth with the certainty of something that has been true for a long time and has finally run out of reasons to remain unspoken. He turned to look at her. The winter light was very clean and she could see his face completely. "I love you," he said, with the directness of a man who has been thinking of little else for several months and is enormously relieved to have the floor. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it." "There is no right way," she said. "There is just saying it." "Yes," he said, "I am beginning to understand that you are right about most things." "Not most things," she said. "Many things. Many things that matter," he said. She laughed. He smiled. The river ran below them in the cold, and the sky was enormous and blue, and she thought that this land, this specific piece of the world that she had claimed for her own with a filed deed and considerable stubbornness, had given her something she had not known to ask for. He proposed in March. He did it without theater and without grandeur, which was exactly right for both of them. They were standing in her kitchen after dinner, and he had been quiet for the better part of an hour with the concentrated stillness of someone working through something they want to say precisely. "I want to marry you," he said, "not because of the land. Not because of any practical arrangement, though I can see we would be formidable together practically, which is not nothing. Because of you. Because you are the most alive person I have ever known, and because I cannot imagine building what comes next without you in it." Ruby looked at him. Her hands were on the table and his hands were near them but not quite touching, which felt like a question. She put her hands over his. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want to marry you," he exhaled. She had the distinct impression that he had been more uncertain than he appeared, which she found endearing in a way she would not tell him immediately. "The land stays mine," she said. "My deed, my name on it." "I would not have it any other way," he said, "and I mean that without qualification." She believed him. She had spent 11 months learning when to believe him, and this was one of those times. "We should tell Mac," she said. "Mac already knows," Ralph said. "He has known for months." "Did you tell him?" "He told me," Ralph said, which is typical of him. They were married in May of 1883, exactly 1 year and 1 month after Ruby had filed the deed in the Dusty Creek County Clerk's office. The ceremony was held outdoors, which Ruby had insisted on, in the meadow above the river bend where she had told him she loved him. Chester Pratt attended. Mac Donald attended and cried with such unabashed openness that he had to borrow 2 handkerchiefs. Will Decker and Frank Orozco and Samuel Reeves attended and wore their Sunday clothes with the slightly rigid bearing of men in unfamiliar garments. Crane came, having ridden 3 days from a neighboring county because Mac had written to him. The minister, a Reverend Hollies from 2 towns over, conducted the ceremony with appropriate brevity and looked slightly startled by the 2 people in front of him, who were conducting themselves with a calm mutual certainty that was unusual in his experience of wedding ceremonies. Ruby wore a dress the color of slate blue that she had made herself, which had taken 3 weeks and several choice words she was glad Reverend Hollies had not been present to hear. She wore her hair loose for the first time anyone in Dusty Creek had seen it, which turned out to be dark red and wavy and very long, and Ralph looked at her when she came across the meadow toward him with an expression that she was going to think about for a very long time. "You look," he started. "Do not make me cry before the ceremony," she said. "You do not cry easily," he said. "I do now," she said, apparently. He took her hands, she took his. The ceremony was brief and genuine, and when it was over and the Reverend said the formal words, Ralph kissed her with exactly the same careful seriousness as the first time and considerably more confidence. And someone, she suspected it was Mac, made a noise of celebration that startled a bird from the cottonwood trees. The first year of their marriage was the hardest and the best. Hard because combining 2 established operations while maintaining the independence of each required precision and patience, and several conversations that went on until midnight with coffee growing cold on the table. Ruby had been clear from the engagement. Her property remained her property. Her deed, her management decisions, her name on the accounts. They would work together on shared interests, but the Holloway parcel was hers. Ralph agreed to this without reservation and demonstrated the agreement in practice, which was the more important thing. When one of his suppliers asked to deal with him directly rather than with Ruby on a transaction that involved her land, Ralph redirected the man to Ruby with such efficient finality that the supplier never made the same error again. When a county official arrived in the autumn of 1883, with a document that he described as an administrative consolidation of adjacent properties, and that Ruby identified in approximately 45 seconds as an attempt to absorb her property into her husband's holdings on the assumption that they were now legally synonymous. She sent the official back to his office with a document of her own that cited 3 specific Texas land statutes and invited the county to revisit the question if they felt their position was supportable. They did not revisit it. Ralph, who had witnessed this exchange, said nothing until the official had ridden away and then said, quietly, "You knew immediately, did you not?" The moment he said administrative consolidation, she said. "Has this happened before?" he asked. "To other women," she said. "Yes, frequently." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not realize," he said. "Most people do not," she said, "until it happens to someone they know." "I am sorry," he said. He meant the specific and the general both, and she understood that. "Thank you," she said. "The statutes did the work." The spring of 1884 brought new cattle and new challenges, and the discovery that Ruby was expecting their first child. She sat with this information for 2 days before she told him, not because she was uncertain how he would receive it, but because she needed to arrange her own feelings first, which were considerable and various. She had not thought extensively about children. She had been occupied with land and cattle and ledgers and the ongoing project of herself. But the feeling that arrived with the knowledge was not the alarm she might have expected. It was something closer to the feeling she had sitting on the rise above the river bend that morning in the cold. Certainty. The specific recognition of something that was right. She told him in the evening by the fire. The expression on his face was one of the best things she had ever seen. He did not immediately say anything. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he came to sit beside her, very close, and he put his arm around her in the way of someone who is being very careful about something precious. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am healthy and the land is producing well, and I have you, and I am going to have a child." "And," he said. "And I am happy," she said, simply and without complexity. "I am genuinely happy, Ralph." He pressed his lips to her temple. "So am I," he said quietly, "more than I can find adequate words for." "You are not usually short of words," she observed. "I am tonight," he said. "A son was born in November of 1884. They named him James Clarence Talbot, James for Mac MacDonald and Clarence for her uncle. He was born in the ranch house with the help of the town doctor and the brisk efficiency of the Dusty Creek midwife, who had attended 53 births and ran each one with the quiet authority of an experienced general. James was a vigorous and opinionated infant, who expressed his views on most aspects of his situation with considerable volume. Mac MacDonald visited 3 days after the birth and held the baby with the intense concentration of a man handling something extraordinarily valuable, and said that the boy had the look of someone who would be trouble in the best possible way, which Ruby thought was probably accurate. Ralph held his son in the evening quiet of the ranch house with the same expression he had made when she had told him she was expecting, that particular openness, the specific softness of a man who is not afraid of his feelings. "He has your eyes," Ralph said. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "I can already tell." "You cannot tell anything from a 3-day-old, he said. "I told everything about you from your face in a county clerk's office," she said. He laughed. James, apparently objecting to the disturbance, made his views known. Ruby took the baby and settled him, and Ralph watched her, and the firelight was gold and warm, and the Panhandle winter was cold and clear outside. And inside this small house that she had roofed and chimneyed and made into something real, something that was completely and specifically hers, she was at the center of everything she had built. The years that followed were full in the way of a good life, which is to say they contained difficulty and triumph and loss and growth, and the constant movement of time that changes everything slowly, and then suddenly. Mac MacDonald retired from active ranch work in 1886 due to a knee that had been complaining for years, and finally won the argument, and settled into a role as general advisor and unofficial grandfather to James, who adored him with the uncomplicated intensity of small children. Mac lived in the bunkhouse by choice, having declined both Ruby's offer of the spare room and Ralph's offer of a cottage on his land, on the grounds that a man who had slept in a bunkhouse for 20 years was not going to start being precious about it now. Chester Pratt, who had guided Ruby to her land on that first visit and had watched everything since with the satisfied air of someone whose instincts about people had been confirmed, dropped by periodically for coffee and to catch them up on Dusty Creek affairs. The town itself was growing. A second general store had opened. A schoolhouse had been built in 1885, which Ruby had contributed to financially and physically, organizing a supply drive that brought lumber from Fort Worth at a substantially reduced rate through a negotiation she completed in 2 letters and 1 telegram. She sat on the school board for 4 years, which generated some initial resistance from certain members of the community, and which she treated with the same equable, documented certainty she brought to all opposition, until the resistance quietly stopped. The ranch grew. By 1887, the Holloway parcel was running 80 head and producing a profit that she had projected in her accounts 3 years earlier and hit almost exactly. She had added a bunkhouse extension, a proper stable, and a root cellar. She had also acquired the Hendricks land when old Bert finally acknowledged that the drainage problem had become unmanageable and offered to sell. She bought it at a fair price and had the drainage corrected within 1 season, adding another 160 acres to her operation. Her operation. Hers. On every document, every deed, every account, Ruby Townsend Talbot. Ralph had commented once, early in their marriage, that she kept her birth name attached to his, and she had looked at him, and said that she intended to keep every name that belonged to her, and he had said yes, of course, naturally. And she had understood from his tone that he was not merely saying it to be agreeable, but that he genuinely felt it, and that this was one of many moments in which she understood she had found the right person. She became pregnant again in 1887. This time she felt different from the start, harder to explain but certain in the way she was certain about weather and about water and about the quality of soil. She told Ralph early, and he received the news with the same particular warmth as before, but with the additional ease of a man who is no longer afraid of everything that could go wrong. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888, which seemed appropriate. They named her Eleanor Rose Talbot, Eleanor for Ralph's mother and Rose because Ruby had been watching the wild roses come up along the south fence that week and had felt it was the right name. Eleanor was quieter than James from the beginning, more watchful, with her father's dark eyes, and what appeared to be her mother's inclination toward forming a complete opinion before expressing it. James, at 3, accepted his sister with a mixture of suspicion and proprietary care that was very much in keeping with his general personality. Life was full. Life was genuinely full in all the ways that Ruby had not known, when she was a bookkeeper in San Antonio sitting over other people's numbers, could be possible for her. She still wrote arithmetic every morning, though arithmetic was older now and slower, and Ruby sometimes took the younger Gray she had acquired in 1886, whom she had also named after a concept, calculation. She rode the boundary and checked the fences and assessed the cattle and looked at the sky and read the land the way she had learned to read it, which was the way her uncle had read it, and his uncle before him, and the people of this land before any of them. On a morning in the autumn of 1889, she stopped on the rise above the river bend and looked out over the property, and she could see the whole of it from here. The house with the new addition they had built last summer, the stable, the bunkhouse where Frank Orozco and 2 newer hands were already moving about in the early light, the garden that was done for the season but would come back in the spring, the cattle in the south pasture, the river running clean and strong between its shored banks. She heard a horse behind her, and Ralph came up and stopped beside her, and they looked out over the land together. "I was thinking about the creek pasture," she said. "I want to try a different grass there in the spring. There is a variety from the Eastern Territories that Mac mentioned in that pamphlet you brought him." "I read about it," Ralph said. "It would work. I thought so. I was thinking about the north fence," he said. "The posts are aging. I want to get ahead of it this winter." "I was going to suggest that." They looked at each other. "We spend a great deal of time thinking the same things," he said. "We think different things, and they frequently arrive at the same place," she said. "That is not the same as thinking the same things," he smiled. "That is a meaningful distinction. Most distinctions are meaningful," she said. "That is why they exist." He reached across and took her hand, the way he did sometimes when they were riding together, just a brief and complete acknowledgement. She held it. Below them the river moved in the early light, and the sky was enormous, and the grass went on to the horizon in every direction, and the cattle were the small, slow shapes of creatures entirely at home. She thought about the county clerk's office in April of 1882, the document in her hand, the sound of it on the desk. She thought about Ralph's face in that moment, the collision of his certainty with hers, the start of something that neither of them had seen coming. She thought about everything that had been built since, board by board, post by post, season by season, word by word. The fence and the roof and the chimney and the accounts. The cattle drive and the fire under the stars and the first kiss and the proposal in the kitchen and the ceremony in the meadow. Mac's handkerchiefs. James's first words, which had been not the expected simple syllables but a clearly pronounced question about where the horses went at night, delivered at 11 months with the expectant look of someone who required a complete answer. Eleanor's particular serious watchfulness, and the way she had already, at 18 months, demonstrated a clear preference for being in the outdoor air over any other situation. She thought about her Uncle Clarence, who had looked at this land and seen something worth building, and had left it to the one member of his family he had trusted to understand that. She thought that he had been right. "James asked me last night," Ralph said, "where our land stops." "What did you say?" "I told him that the south pasture ended at that fence line, and the river was ours on both banks to the eastern canyon, and the north line went as far as you could ride before lunch." "Before lunch," she said. "He understands measures he can test," Ralph said. She looked at him with the warmth that had been there for 7 years now and had not diminished but had deepened in the way of good things that receive the conditions they need. "Did he then immediately attempt to ride to the north line before lunch?" "He is 4, Ralph said. "So yes. Frank stopped him at the garden fence." She laughed. James was, as Mac had predicted, trouble in the best possible way. He was also generous and curious, and had his father's basic honesty and his mother's constitutionally undeterrable forward movement, which was a combination that was going to make him interesting for his entire life. "I was thinking," Ralph said carefully in the tone that meant he had been thinking about it considerably, "about next year." "What about it?" "The Crane parcel to the east," he said. "Old Crane mentioned last spring that he is considering selling in the next 2 years. His sons have gone north. He has no one to leave it to." Ruby turned to look at him. The Crane parcel was 230 acres of excellent land that abutted her eastern boundary and had water access she had been watching with interest for 2 years. "His asking price would be substantial," she said. "Between the two of us, it is manageable," he said, "if we plan for it now." "Between the 2 operations," she clarified. "Yes," he said, "between yours and mine, separately managed, jointly purchased if you prefer." She looked at the land below them and the river and the sky. She thought about 230 more acres. She thought about her accounts, which she knew exactly, and his accounts, which she knew nearly as exactly because they discussed them regularly. "I want to run the numbers," she said. "Of course," he said. "I want to look at the water access plan before anything is discussed with Crane." "Agreed." "And I want the deed in both names," she said, "reflecting equal ownership." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." She squeezed his hand once firmly. He squeezed back. Below them, distantly, James could be heard from the direction of the bunkhouse producing a complicated argument about something, delivered with the confident volume of a person who has no doubt that his argument is valid. Frank Orozco's patient response followed. "We should go back," Ruby said. "Yes," Ralph said. They turned their horses toward the house, down the rise, through the morning light that was coming up gold and clean over the canyon rim, and laying itself across the grass and the river, and the land that she had claimed and held and built and loved, and would give, in time, to children who would give it to their children, in the long, continuous way of things that are rooted deeply enough to last. The Holloway parcel, filed under the name of Ruby Townsend Talbot, 412 acres along the South Fork of the Cimarron River, Dusty Creek, Texas. Suitable, as it turned out, in every possible regard. They had breakfast together that morning, all 4 of them, and Mac MacDonald, who appeared at the kitchen door as he frequently did, with the comfortable certainty of someone who knows his welcome. James ate with the focused determination of a child who is going to need energy for the extremely full day of being 4 that he is planning. Eleanor sat in her chair and watched everything with her serious dark eyes. Ralph poured coffee without being asked, and set it in front of Ruby first and then his own, and looked at her over the rim when he drank it with the expression she had learned, meant simple contentment, the particular peace of someone who is exactly where they need to be. Max said something about the north fence. Frank appeared at the kitchen window with a question about the east water trough. Outside, the morning was expanding into full day, bright and clear and cold, with a November sky that was the deep blue of things that are true. Ruby set down her coffee and opened the account ledger she had brought to the table and made a notation about the Crane parcel that she intended to think through carefully over the coming weeks. James leaned over to look at the numbers with the expression of someone forming a preliminary opinion. Alina reached across and put one small hand on the edge of the page. Ruby looked at her daughter. Alina looked back with her father's dark eyes and waited to see what would happen next. "This is the ledger for this ranch," Ruby told her, because she believed in telling children the true names of things. "These numbers tell us what we have and what we owe and what we are building toward." Alina considered this with due seriousness. "When you are older," Ruby said, "I will show you how to read it." Alina patted the page once approvingly and reached for her cup. Ralph caught Ruby's eye across the table. His expression was the one that still, after 7 years, made her want to look at it for a long time. She gave him the specific smile she had for him alone, the one that was not composed or measured but simply real, and went back to her ledger and her plans and the long, rooted, certain, entirely her own life she had built with her hands and her will, and the deed she had filed before a man could finish telling her something that turned out not to be true. The morning light came through the windows of the ranch house she had repaired, and the ranch she had built, and the life she had claimed and held against every expectation, and it was warm and specific and completely, perfectly right. Outside on the river, the water moved as it always moved, south and constant and unbothered by history, through the canyon country and the grass and the clean, cold air of the Texas Panhandle. The cottonwoods were bare and silver and would be full and green in the spring. The mockingbirds were gone south for the winter and would come back. The cattle were in the south pasture doing what cattle do in the morning, which is mostly standing and being reassuringly solid. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything had been built for this. Ruby Townsend Talbot closed the ledger, finished her coffee, stood up from the table, and went out to meet the day.